4-year-old asks her father why the sky is blue, and when he answers, she asks why light bends that way. And when he answers that too, she asks what makes it true, until eventually he runs out of true things to say and simply admits he does not know. Most conversations stop right there, not because the child stops wanting to know, but because the honest answers do. Philosophy is what happens when someone refuses to stop at that point and keeps asking anyway, for years, for centuries, in some cases for millennia. Over the next 2 hours, this list sits with 45 of the hardest questions civilization has ever taken seriously, about the self, time, morality, knowledge and existence itself, including why the universe apparently bothered to exist at all, instead of remaining empty, and what would actually happen to a man who stepped into a teleporter and walked out somewhere else entirely. None of these will be resolved by the end. Some have been argued for 25 centuries by minds considerably sharper than any single answer could ever satisfy, and that persistence is not a failure of philosophy. It is closer to philosophy's actual shape. There is no need to rush through any of it. Settle in. These particular questions have been waiting a very long time for company, and they are patient enough to wait through however long this takes. Nothing at all was, by every account physics can offer, a live possibility, no space, no time, no laws, not even the emptiness cosmologists call a vacuum, since a vacuum still requires the laws that let it fluctuate. And yet here is a universe, ours, sprawling and specific and demanding an explanation that no one has ever supplied. The philosopher Gottfried Leibniz asked it plainly, why is there something rather than nothing? His own answer leaned on a principle of sufficient reason, the idea that everything true has an explanation, which pushed him toward a necessary being outside the chain of causes, something that exists simply because its non-existence would be a contradiction. Centuries later, physicists tried a quieter version of the same move. Perhaps the universe simply came from a quantum vacuum, and quantum fields do produce particles from what looks like emptiness. But that vacuum is not nothing in the strict philosophical sense. It is a highly structured something, governed by laws that themselves need explaining. Push the question back far enough, and you reach the same wall Leibniz reached. Either the chain of explanations terminates in something that requires no further cause, or it does not terminate at all and stretches back forever, which many find just as puzzling as a sudden beginning. Some thinkers now argue the question itself may be malformed, that existence is not the kind of thing that needs a reason, that asking why there is something rather than nothing quietly assumes nothing was ever the default state, when nothing may not be a state at all, just an absence of the concept working correctly. Others insist that giving up on the question too early is its own kind of failure of nerve. Neither side has produced anything close to consensus, and cosmologists and metaphysicians continue to publish competing accounts on opposite sides of the same abyss. The universe does not owe anyone an explanation for turning up, and it simply did. Picture yourself asleep tonight, and picture the person who wakes up in your bed tomorrow morning, remembering your name, wearing your habits, certain that they are you. Nothing about that certainty is guaranteed by anything philosophers have managed to prove. John Locke argued that personal identity rests on continuity of memory and consciousness, not on the body or the soul. You are the same person as your childhood self insofar as a chain of remembered experience links you to them. But memory is famously leaky. Most adults cannot recall being 2 years old, and yet no one doubts the toddler in an old photograph was them. Locke's critics noticed the problem quickly. If identity depends on a chain of overlapping memories, a person could in principle become disconnected from an earlier self through ordinary forgetting, and by Locke's own logic, that would mean they are no longer, strictly, that earlier person. Derek Parfit pushed the puzzle further with a series of thought experiments involving gradual replacement, split brains, and teleportation, arguing that personal identity may not be the deep, all-or-nothing fact everyone assumes. What matters, he suggested, might not be strict identity at all but psychological continuity and connectedness, a matter of degree rather than a hard yes or no. On his view, the question of whether tomorrow's version of you is, really, you might be less important than most people instinctively feel it is, since what actually matters, cares and plans is the ongoing pattern of memory, personality and intention, not some further fact hiding beneath it. Not every philosopher accepts that conclusion. Many find it deeply counterintuitive that identity could simply not be the kind of thing at stake in survival. Whatever tomorrow's version of you turns out to be, it will wake up utterly convinced of the answer. In 1980, the philosopher John Searle imagined a man locked in a room, following an enormous rulebook that tells him exactly how to respond to Chinese characters slipped under the door, without understanding a single word of Chinese. From outside, the room produces flawless Chinese conversation. Searle's question was simple. Does anything in that room actually understand Chinese, or is it just shuffling symbols that look like understanding from the outside? His thought experiment, known as the Chinese room, was aimed squarely at the idea that a computer running the right program could genuinely think, rather than merely simulate thinking. If the man in the room does not understand Chinese despite producing perfect answers, Searle argued, then no computer running a similar symbol manipulation program understands anything either, no matter how convincing its output. Critics have pushed back for decades. Some argue that understanding is not located in the man alone, but in the whole system, the man plus the rulebook plus the room, an argument called the system's reply. Others question whether human brains are doing anything fundamentally different from symbol manipulation themselves, given that neurons are, at bottom, just electrochemical signals following physical rules. The debate has only sharpened with the arrival of large language models that write essays, hold conversations, and pass many tests once thought to require genuine comprehension. Some researchers argue these systems demonstrate a kind of functional understanding worth taking seriously. Others maintain that fluent output is not evidence of an inner experience, and that the room's lesson still holds. Behaving as if you understand is not the same as understanding. No experiment yet devised can settle which side is right, because the disagreement is not really about behavior at all. It is about what is happening, if anything, on the inside. Nobody outside a mind has ever managed to look directly into one. Physics has never found a variable in its equations that flows. Time appears in the mathematics of relativity as simply another dimension, laid out alongside length, width, and height, with past and future both equally present in what physicists call the block universe, yet almost no one experiences time that way. The tension runs deep. In Einstein's relativity, simultaneity itself is relative. Two events that happen at the same moment for one observer can happen at different moments for another observer moving at a different speed, which makes it difficult to even define a single universal now. If there is no privileged present moment built into physics, some philosophers argue, then the vivid feeling that time is passing, that the present is somehow special and racing forward while the past recedes and the future waits, may be a feature of human consciousness rather than a feature of the universe itself. This view is sometimes called eternalism, the idea that past, present, and future all exist equally, the way that the middle of a river exists just as much as its source or its mouth. Other philosophers resist this conclusion strongly, arguing that if nothing actually flows, change itself becomes hard to explain, and change is about as basic a fact about the world as any fact could be. J.M.E. Mucktaggart, writing in 1908, argued that both ways of describing time lead to contradictions, and concluded that time itself might not be fully real in the way it appears to be, a conclusion almost no one since has been comfortable accepting, and almost no one has managed to refute outright either. Whether the clock on the wall is measuring something moving, or just something arranged, no one has found a way to check from outside time itself to see which. In 1974, the philosopher Thomas Nagel published a short essay asking a question that sounds almost silly on its surface. What is it like to be a bat? Bats navigate by echolocation, sensing the world through returning sound in a way no human sense resembles, and Nagel's point was that no amount of studying a bat's biology from the outside will ever tell you what that sensing actually feels like from the inside. Nagel used the bat to sharpen a much larger claim about consciousness. Physical science describes the world from an objective third-person point of view. Neurons firing, sound waves bouncing, brain regions lighting up. But conscious experience, he argued, has an irreducibly first-person character, a subjective what-it-is-likeness that a complete physical description seems to leave out entirely. You could know everything about a bat's echolocating brain, and still not know what it is like to experience the world that way, in the same sense that a person who has never seen colour could memorize every fact about wavelengths and retinas, and still not know what red looks like. This argument became one of the central pieces of what philosophers now call the hard problem of consciousness, explaining why there is subjective experience at all, rather than a universe that simply processes information in the dark, with no one home to notice. Some philosophers, including Nagel's critics, argue that once neuroscience is complete enough, the gap will close and the subjective feeling will simply turn out to be identical to certain physical processes. Others, following Nagel, suspect the gap is not a temporary shortfall of knowledge, but a permanent limit built into what physical description can ever capture. A bat crosses a night sky reading the world in sound, and whatever that is like, it is like that only for the bat. You have never once had direct access to another person's pain, joy, or private thought, only their words, their face, their behaviour, and an inference built entirely from your own case. Philosophers call this the problem of other minds, and it has resisted a clean solution for centuries. The classic worry runs like this. You know your own mind directly through your own experience of thinking and feeling, but you know other people only through their outward behaviour, and you assume, by analogy with yourself, that similar behaviour in others reflects a similar inner life. The trouble is that the inference is never watertight. Nothing in principle rules out the old philosophical nightmare of a world full of what thinkers call philosophical zombies, beings who act exactly like conscious people, wince exactly like conscious people, and say all the right things, yet have no inner experience at all behind any of it. If such a being is even conceivable without contradiction, some argue, then behaviour alone can never prove consciousness is present, only suggest it. Wittgenstein tried to dissolve rather than answer the puzzle, arguing that concepts like pain get their meaning from shared public behaviour and language, not from some hidden private object each person is separately guessing at in someone else's head. On his view, doubting whether others feel pain the way you do may be a confusion about how the word pain works in the first place, rather than a real gap in knowledge. Critics reply that this move explains how we talk about other minds without ever explaining whether there really is someone home behind the talking. Every conversation you have ever had has been, in a strict sense, a conversation with an assumption. Every human culture on record has some concept of fairness, yet no two cultures have ever agreed completely on what counts as fair. That single fact sits at the centre of one of ethics' oldest disputes, whether moral truths are things we discover the way we discover mathematical truths, or things we invent the way we invent traffic laws. Moral realists argue that statements like cruelty is wrong are true or false in the same objective way that the Earth orbits the Sun is true or false, independent of what anyone happens to believe. On this view, a society that practiced widespread slavery was not merely following a different custom, it was factually wrong, in exactly the sense that a society believing the Earth is flat is factually wrong. Moral anti-realists resist this, arguing that morality is better explained as a human construction, built from evolved social instincts, cultural convention, and shared practical need, without any objective fact of the matter floating independently of human minds and preferences. The debate has real teeth. If morality is invented, critics worry. It becomes hard to explain why anyone should think their own moral convictions carry more weight than a rival culture's opposing convictions. Both would simply be different constructions, neither one more true than the other. If morality is discovered, defenders of realism must explain how humans, evolved primarily to survive and reproduce, ever gained reliable access to a realm of objective moral facts in the first place, a problem sometimes called the evolutionary debunking challenge. Some philosophers try a middle path, arguing morality is neither purely invented nor discovered in the way mathematics is, but grounded instead in facts about what causes suffering and flourishing in creatures like us, which is real without being independent of us entirely. No side has produced an experiment that could settle it, because the disagreement sits one level below anything an experiment could reach. Somewhere past the year 2100, people who cannot vote in today's elections, cannot speak in today's debates, and do not yet exist in any sense at all, will inherit whatever the current century leaves behind. Philosophers call this the problem of intergenerational justice, and it breaks several tools ethics normally relies on. Most ethical theories were built around obligations between people who can, at least in principle, interact, bargain, or reciprocate. Future generations cannot do any of that. They cannot consent to today's decisions, cannot negotiate a fairer deal, and cannot punish today's choices except by inheriting their consequences. The philosopher Derek Parfit identified a related puzzle called the non-identity problem. Many of the specific people who will exist in the future depend entirely on choices made today, since different policies lead to different people being born at all. That makes it strange to say a particular future person is harmed by, say, climate policy today, because had policy gone differently, that exact person might never have existed to be harmed in the first place, and some other person would exist instead. Some philosophers argue this puzzle is a reason to weight the interests of future generations less heavily, since their identities are not fixed, and their harms are diffuse and uncertain. Others argue the opposite, that indifference to unidentified future people is exactly the moral failure the puzzle should expose, since it would let any present-day damage escape blame merely because we cannot name its victims in advance. Economists add a further wrinkle with the practice of discounting, treating a harm a century from now as mathematically less significant than the same harm today, a convention that makes long-run environmental costs look smaller on paper than they may turn out to feel to the people who actually live through them. Nobody currently owed anything has been born yet to ask for it. Every event in a strictly deterministic universe, from the collision of atoms to the firing of a single neuron, is the fixed result of what came immediately before it. If human decisions are made of neurons, and neurons obey physical law, a hard question follows quickly. Where exactly in that unbroken chain does free choice enter? Hard determinists take the physics at face value and conclude that free will, in the sense of an ability to have genuinely done otherwise, is an illusion, however convincing it feels from the inside. Libertarians, in the philosophical rather than political sense, argue instead that something about human agency escapes the deterministic chain entirely, whether through a soul, an uncaused act of will, or some feature of quantum indeterminacy at the smallest scales, though critics note that a random quantum fluctuation is not obviously any more free than a determined cause, just less predictable. A third position, compatibilism, tries to have both. Compatibilists argue that free will was never really about escaping causation at all, but about acting according to your own reasons, desires, and character without external coercion. On this view, a person who chooses to donate to charity because it reflects their genuine values is acting freely, even if that choice was itself caused by a lifetime of prior experiences, upbringing, and brain chemistry, because freedom was never incompatible with causation in the first place, only with force and constraint. Critics of compatibilism argue this quietly redefines free will into something weaker than what most people actually mean by the term, since your character itself, on a fully deterministic picture, was never something you chose. Modern neuroscience has only sharpened the stakes. Studies measuring brain activity before a person reports deciding to act have found signals preceding conscious awareness of the decision by measurable fractions of a second, results that some researchers read as evidence against conscious free will, and others read as evidence about the timing of awareness. Somewhere inside every decision made today, a chain of causes reached back further than anyone chose to look. Prime numbers behave identically whether or not any conscious being has ever noticed them, which raises an old and stubborn question. Are mathematical objects like numbers and triangles discovered, waiting out there to be found, or invented, built entirely out of human definitions and convention? Mathematical Platonism holds that numbers, sets, and geometric shapes exist in an abstract realm outside space and time, independent of any mind the way planets exist independent of astronomers. On this view, mathematicians are explorers rather than inventors, and a proof does not create a truth so much as reveal one that was already there. Critics find this picture strange for a simple reason. If mathematical objects are truly outside space and time, with no causal connection to the physical brains doing the discovering, it is hard to explain how mathematicians ever manage to access them reliably at all. A challenge sometimes called the access problem. Formalists take the opposite view, arguing that mathematics is essentially an elaborate game of symbol manipulation according to agreed rules, with no deeper metaphysical commitment required, closer to invented rules of chess than to a discovered feature of reality. The trouble here is what philosophers call the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Formal systems invented for their own internal elegance keep turning out, decades or centuries later, to describe the physical universe with startling precision, from imaginary numbers eventually describing electromagnetic waves to non-Euclidean geometry, eventually describing the curvature of space-time. If mathematics were pure invention with no connection to reality, that repeated uncanny fit would be a remarkable coincidence. A third camp, intuitionists, argue mathematical truth is constructed by the reasoning mind step by step, and a statement is not true or false until someone actually proves or disproves it, a position with real consequences for how mathematics itself should be practiced. Whatever numbers turn out to be, they keep working exactly the same way whether anyone believes in them or not. Every legal system on Earth locks people in cells, and almost none of those systems can agree on why doing so is actually justified, only that it apparently must be. Retributivists argue punishment is justified because wrongdoers deserve to suffer consequences proportional to their crime, a debt owed and repaid, independent of whether punishing them produces any further benefit to society. Immanuel Kant took this to a striking extreme, arguing that even if a society were about to dissolve entirely, it would still be obligated to execute its last convicted murderer first, because justice demands it regardless of consequence. Consequentialists reject this framing almost entirely, arguing punishment is only justified by what it accomplishes, deterring future crime, protecting the public by incapacitating dangerous people, or rehabilitating offenders back into society. On a purely consequentialist view, punishing an innocent person could in principle be justified if it produced enough deterrent benefit, a conclusion most consequentialists find so troubling they build in extra rules specifically to rule it out. A third approach, restorative justice, reframes the whole question, arguing that crime is fundamentally a harm done to a victim and a community, not merely a violation of abstract law, and that the point of a justice response should be repairing that harm, rather than inflicting proportional suffering on the offender. Critics worry this approach can struggle with crimes that have no clear victim able to participate in the process, or offenders with no genuine wish to repair anything. Beneath all three theories sits a harder question none of them fully answers. What would actually make a person deserve suffering in the first place, given that most explanations of why people commit crimes point backward toward causes, like upbringing and circumstance, that the offender never chose? Every prison sentence handed down today rests on a justification still being argued about in philosophy departments this evening. Two people stand before the same painting. One is moved to tears, the other shrugs and checks the time. Something in that gap has occupied aesthetics for as long as philosophers have bothered to write about art at all. David Hume argued that beauty is not a quality residing in objects themselves, but a feeling produced in a perceiver's mind, meaning, strictly speaking, there is no beauty independent of someone experiencing it, only objects with a tendency to produce that feeling in suitably sensitive observers. Yet Hume did not conclude that all aesthetic judgments are therefore equally valid. He argued that a true judge of art needs practice, comparison, freedom from prejudice, and good sense, which implies some responses are simply better calibrated than others, even if beauty itself is not an objective property, waiting to be measured. Immanuel Kant took a related but distinct path, arguing that a genuine judgment of beauty claims universal agreement, even though it rests on subjective feeling, a strange hybrid he called disinterested pleasure, distinct from mere personal liking, like preferring one flavour of food to another. Objectivists push back against both, arguing that some works really are better than others by identifiable standards. Technical mastery, formal balance, originality, emotional depth, standards that can be taught, argued about and defended with reasons, not just reported as private preference. If beauty were purely subjective, they argue, art criticism itself would be meaningless, no more substantive than arguing over favourite colours. Yet serious critics clearly do more than that, building cases that persuade other people to see a work differently. Neuroscience has recently entered the argument, finding that certain visual proportions and symmetries reliably activate reward circuits across human brains, are finding some read as evidence for objective aesthetic standards rooted in biology, and others read as merely explaining why certain illusions of beauty are so widely shared, without settling whether the underlying judgment is really about the object at all. The painting has not changed since either viewer walked into the room. For roughly 2,000 years, just war theory has tried to draw a clean moral line around one of humanity's oldest and bloodiest activities, and the line still will not hold still. The tradition, developed by thinkers including A.W. Gustine and later refined by Thomas A.W. Aquinas, splits the question into two parts. Jus ad bellum asks whether it is right to go to war at all, requiring a just cause, a legitimate authority to declare it, a reasonable chance of success, and war only as a last resort after other options are exhausted. Josin Bello asks whether a war once underway is being fought rightly, requiring proportionality between force used and objective sought and a clear effort to spare non-combatants from direct harm. In principle, these criteria let philosophers distinguish a justified defensive war from naked aggression, and a disciplined military campaign from an atrocity. In practice, every criterion strains under real cases. Proportionality asks a commander to weigh military advantage against civilian harm in the middle of a chaotic and uncertain event, a calculation that looks very different in hindsight than it did in the moment. Distinguishing combatants from non-combatants gets harder in wars fought among civilian populations in cities, and increasingly, with drones and cyber operations, in conflicts where no soldier is ever physically present at all. Pacifist philosophers reject the whole framework, arguing that a theory built to justify some wars will always end up justifying too many. Since almost every nation that goes to war insists its own cause is the just one, some philosophers now argue the categories of victor and vanquished tell you less about who was right than about who simply had more force to bring to bear, a suspicion just war theory was invented specifically to resist. No war in recorded history has ever been fought by two sides that agreed at the time about which one was the aggressor. Ask someone why they deserve their success, and most people point to hard work. Ask them why they were born capable of that particular kind of hard work, and the answer runs out quickly. Desert, the philosophical term for what a person is entitled to based on their actions or qualities, sounds intuitive until it is pressed. A student who studies hard deserves a good grade. Most people agree. But the capacity to sit still, concentrate, delay gratification, and stay motivated is itself shaped by genetics, upbringing, nutrition, and sheer luck of temperament, none of which the student chose any more than they chose their height. If effort itself is caused by factors outside a person's control, some philosophers argue, then desert claims quietly collapse into claims about luck dressed up in moral language. John Rawls Z made this the foundation of an influential argument about justice, contending that since no one deserves their natural talents or their starting circumstances in any deep sense, a just society should not distribute rewards purely according to those undeserved advantages, but should instead design institutions that benefit even those born with the least favourable starting hand. Critics of Rawls Z worry this view drains all meaning from personal responsibility, since if nothing is ever truly deserved, praise and blame both start to look incoherent, and a society built on that premise may struggle to motivate anyone to strive for anything at all. A middle position argues that desert survives in a narrower form. Even if you did not choose your raw talents, you are still the one who chose, moment to moment, how to use them, and that ongoing exercise of will, however conditioned by circumstance, might be enough to ground at least some claim to credit or blame. The trophy on the shelf was earned by someone who never chose to be the kind of person capable of earning it. Epicurus argued, more than 2,000 years ago, that death is nothing to fear for a strange and precise reason. While you exist, death is not present, and once death is present, you no longer exist to experience it, so the two never actually meet. His argument, sometimes called the symmetry argument, tries to dissolve the fear of death rather than console someone facing it. If experience is required for something to be bad for a person, and death eliminates the experiencer entirely, then death cannot be bad for the person it happens to, in the same way pain or loss can be bad, because there is no longer anyone there to suffer it. Critics have never found this fully satisfying, even when they cannot locate the flaw in the logic. Thomas Nagel argued that death can be bad not because it causes suffering, but because it deprives a person of goods they would otherwise have had, the deprivation view. Years of experience, relationships, and projects that would have continued, cut short. On this account, death's badness is comparative rather than experiential, measured against the life that would otherwise have unfolded, which sidesteps Epicurus' argument that there is no subject present to be harmed. A further wrinkle complicates both positions, the asymmetry problem. Most people are far more troubled by the prospect of dying young than by the fact that they did not exist for the infinite stretch of time before they were born, even though both are, in a strict sense, periods of non-existence. Philosophers disagree sharply about why prenatal non-existence troubles almost no one while posthumous non-existence troubles nearly everyone, and no explanation offered so far has commanded wide agreement. The state that ends every biography has never once been described from the inside. Try to describe the exact shade of red in a sunset to someone who has never seen colour, and notice how quickly your words run out of the thing they are supposed to be carrying. Ludwig Wittgenstein spent much of his career on versions of this problem. In his early work, he proposed that language works by picturing facts, with sentences mirroring the logical structure of the states of affairs they describe, a tight correspondence between words and world. Later, he abandoned this picture almost entirely, arguing instead that meaning comes from use, from the countless different games language gets played in, ordering, joking, praying, describing, none of which reduces cleanly to a picture of fact-matching reality. On this later view, expecting language to fully capture reality may be a category error, like expecting a hammer to also function as a thermometer, since language was never built to be a perfect mirror in the first place. The problem sharpens around private experience specifically. Wittgenstein's famous private language argument suggested that a language only one person could ever understand, describing only their own inner sensations with no public check on correct use, would not really be a functioning language at all, because there would be no way to distinguish using a word correctly from simply misremembering how it felt before. That argument has been read as undermining the very idea that words can transmit the raw texture of subjective experience between people, rather than merely coordinating behavior around shared external cues. Some linguists and philosophers following the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis have gone further, arguing that the specific language a person speaks shapes which thoughts are even available to think, not merely which thoughts are easy to express, a claim with strong and weak versions, only the weaker of which has held up under careful testing. Every word ever spoken about the colour red has been an attempt to hand someone else a private thing, and no one has ever actually finished the delivery. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by nations with wildly different religious traditions, legal systems, and philosophical foundations, all agreeing on a list of rights while disagreeing almost entirely about why those rights exist at all. Natural law theorists argue that human rights are grounded in human nature itself, in capacities like reason and moral agency that every person possesses simply by being human, which makes rights something discovered rather than granted, existing prior to and independent of any government or law. Social contract theorists take a different route, arguing rights emerge from an implicit agreement among people to form a society under mutually binding rules, meaning rights are a human construction, useful and important, but not built into the fabric of nature the way natural law theorists claim. The gap matters practically, not just academically. If rights exist independent of any government, then a government violating them is doing something objectively wrong, regardless of its own laws or customs, which is the position most international human rights law quietly assumes. But if rights are only a social construction, then a society that never adopted the relevant social contract, or that constructs a different one, has not obviously done anything wrong by rejecting a right another society insists is universal, since the right was never grounded in anything more solid than agreement in the first place. Critics of universalism raise a related concern, arguing that many declared human rights actually reflect specifically Western liberal values, dressed up as universal facts about all human beings, while defenders respond that the actual content of core rights, freedom from torture, from arbitrary killing, from enslavement, appears independently across a very wide range of moral traditions, which they take as evidence for something closer to a genuinely shared foundation. A right written into international law in 1948 is still waiting for a settled account of where exactly it was found. Look for the thinker of your thoughts and notice what actually turns up. Another thought about looking. David Hume tried this exercise seriously in the 18th century and reported that he could never catch himself, only ever catch a perception, a memory, a feeling, one after another, with no separate observer standing behind them all. Hume's conclusion, sometimes called the bundle theory of the self, held that what we call the self is not a single, unified, continuous thing, but a bundle of related perceptions, following one another with such rapid succession that they create the illusion of a single unbroken subject. Buddhist philosophy arrived independently at a strikingly similar conclusion more than 2,000 years earlier, teaching a doctrine sometimes translated as no-self, which holds that clinging to the idea of a fixed permanent self is itself a major source of suffering, since the self a person is defending does not, on close examination, actually exist as anything stable. Not every philosopher accepts this deflationary picture. Some argue that even if introspection never directly catches a separate observing self, that does not prove no such self exists, only that it may not be the kind of thing introspection is built to detect, in the same way a microscope cannot see the person looking through it. Others point to the ordinary continuity of personality, memory and intention across a lifetime as evidence for something unifying the bundle, even if that something is not a simple, indivisible soul. Modern neuroscience has added an odd twist: split brain studies, in which the two hemispheres of the brain are surgically separated, sometimes reveal what looks like two centers of awareness operating in a single skull, each apparently unaware of what the other is doing. A finding some read as direct evidence against a single unified self, and others read as evidence that unity was always more fragile than it felt. Whatever is reading these words has never once managed to see itself doing it. A child dies painfully of a preventable illness in a small village no news organization ever reaches. If any suffering in the history of the world was pointless, philosophers have long argued that one probably was. The argument from evil, one of the oldest challenges to belief in an all-powerful, all-good deity, runs simply: if a perfectly good and perfectly powerful God existed, that God would prevent all unnecessary suffering, since nothing would stop it and its goodness would demand it. Suffering clearly exists, including suffering with no apparent purpose or lesson attached. Therefore, the argument concludes either no such God exists, or that God's goodness or power is not what it is usually claimed to be. Theodicies are attempts to answer this challenge without abandoning the traditional picture of God. Some argue suffering is the necessary price of free will, since a world where people cannot cause harm is a world where moral choice is not really possible. Others argue suffering builds character or moral depth that could not otherwise exist, sometimes called soul-making theodicy. Critics find both replies strained against specific cases, since it is difficult to identify what free will or character growth an infant's fatal illness could possibly be purchasing. Set the religious framing aside, and the underlying question survives on its own. Utilitarian philosophers ask whether suffering can ever be justified by a greater resulting good, and famously split over whether it is acceptable to inflict serious harm on one person if doing so reliably prevents greater harm to many others, a question at the heart of enduring debates over torture, war, and medical triage. Deontological philosophers resist this trade entirely, arguing some forms of suffering must never be inflicted regardless of the good they might produce, because doing so treats a person merely as a means rather than as an end in themselves. Whether any suffering has ever been justified, the suffering itself was never asked for a vote on the matter. Peter Singer once asked readers to imagine walking past a shallow pond and seeing a child drowning in it. Almost everyone agrees you would be obligated to wade in to pick the child, even if it ruined your expensive clothes. Singer's question was why that obligation seems to evaporate the moment the child in danger is far away instead of directly in front of you. Singer argued that distance and even statistical anonymity should not change the underlying moral calculation. If you can prevent serious harm to a distant stranger, whether from famine, disease, or disaster, at a cost to yourself that is genuinely small by comparison, he argued you are morally obligated to do so, in exactly the way you would be obligated to save the drowning child, because the child's proximity was never the actual source of the obligation, only a vivid trigger for a moral fact that was true all along. Applied consistently, this argument implies dramatically more demanding obligations toward distant strangers than most moral frameworks, and most ordinary intuition are prepared to accept. Critics push back on several fronts. Some argue that special relationships to family, community, and nation genuinely do generate stronger obligations than a stranger's claim, not as a moral failing but as a legitimate feature of how human ethical life actually works, since a morality that demanded identical treatment of everyone everywhere would be almost impossible to live by, and might undermine the very relationships that make sustained moral commitment possible at all. Others worry that Singer's argument, if followed rigorously, leaves almost no space for personal projects, hobbies, or ordinary pleasures, since nearly any discretionary spending could instead prevent someone else's serious suffering somewhere in the world, a demand so total it risks collapsing under its own weight. The pond in Singer's thought experiment was never real, yet real charities have cited it directly in their fundraising appeals, and nobody has ever fully resolved how far the water is supposed to extend. You almost certainly believe you have hands. You almost certainly cannot prove in the strict philosophical sense that you are not a mind floating in a vat somewhere, fed a perfect simulation of having hands. Most epistemologists have made peace with that gap. A few never have. René Descartes tried to rebuild knowledge from absolute certainty, doubting everything that could possibly be doubted, including the reliability of his own senses, until he reached one claim he judged immune to doubt. The fact that he was doubting proved that something was there. Doing the doubting, famously summarized as I think, therefore I am. From that single foundation, he tried to reconstruct everything else he could know. Most philosophers today think the project overreached, since even granting that a thinking thing exists says almost nothing about the external world, other minds or the past. The more common modern position treats knowledge as compatible with a lack of absolute certainty. On a view sometimes called fallibilism, a belief can count as knowledge even though it is, in principle, revisable in light of new evidence, as long as it is well supported, arrived at through reliable methods, and not currently defeated by any known counter-evidence. Science operates almost entirely on this basis. A well-tested theory counts as scientific knowledge, even though a single future observation could in principle overturn it, and working scientists rarely treat this openness to revision as a defect rather than a strength. Skeptics argue fallibilism quietly gives up on knowledge in the strong sense philosophers used to mean by the word, settling instead for something more like well-justified confidence. Fallibilists respond that demanding Cartesian certainty before allowing anything to count as knowledge would mean almost nothing has ever been known by anyone, a conclusion so extreme it undermines itself, since a skeptic advancing that very argument is relying on ordinary reasoning they treat as reliable enough to trust in the moment they are using it. The hand in front of your face has never been proven beyond every possible doubt, and it has never needed to be used. Behind a thick curtain of ignorance, unable to know whether you would be born wealthy or poor, healthy or disabled, into a majority or a persecuted minority, what rules would you choose to govern the society you were about to be born into? That imagined scenario, John Rawls's veil of ignorance, was designed to strip away self-interest from questions of justice. Rawlsy argued that principles chosen under this kind of ignorance would be genuinely fair, since no one designing the rules would know enough about their own eventual position to rig them in their own favour. He predicted that rational people reasoning this way would choose two guiding principles: equal basic liberties for everyone, and economic inequalities permitted, only if they work to the benefit of society's least advantaged members, a rule he called the difference principle. Critics have attacked the thought experiment from several directions. Libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick argued that Rawls's framework focuses entirely on how resources end up distributed, while ignoring whether they were acquired justly in the first place, arguing that a distribution arising from voluntary trades and legitimate ownership can be fair even if it produces significant inequality, and that redistributing it afterward violates the rights of those who acquired their share honestly. Communitarian critics raised a different objection, arguing that Rawls's veil of ignorance imagines a person stripped of the very cultural attachments, relationships, and community memberships that actually make someone who they are, producing principles chosen by an abstraction that resembles no real human being making a real decision. Feminist philosophers have added that a theory of justice built entirely around distributing external resources may miss deeper structural unfairness embedded in family structures, unpaid labour and care work that never shows up as a resource to be distributed at all. Nobody has ever actually stood behind that curtain, and every real society was built by people who already knew exactly which side of it they were standing on. A corporation can own property, sign contracts and be sued in court. A dolphin cannot vote, cannot own anything, and yet clearly suffers, plans, and recognises itself in a mirror. Somewhere between the two sits the concept philosophers call personhood, and the line has never stayed still for long. Traditionally, personhood was tied closely to rationality, the capacity for abstract reasoning, language and self-awareness, criteria that conveniently matched adult human beings and excluded almost everything else. But the criteria strain immediately against hard cases. Infants, people in comas, and individuals with severe cognitive impairments may lack full rational capacity at a given moment, yet almost no one is willing to say they therefore lack moral status or the protections owed to persons. Meanwhile, some animals demonstrate self-recognition, problem-solving, grief, and long-term memory that rival or exceed capacities once thought to be uniquely human, which pushes some philosophers to argue that species membership was never actually doing the moral work people assumed it was. Philosopher Peter Singer and others have argued that the capacity to suffer, rather than rationality, is the more defensible basis for moral consideration, since suffering does not require language or abstract reasoning to be real and to matter to the creature experiencing it. This shift has real consequences. On a sentience-based view, many animals deserve far stronger moral consideration than current law grants them, while some humans in permanent unconscious states might warrant reconsideration of protections built entirely around potential future experience rather than present capacity. The rise of increasingly capable artificial systems has forced the question into new territory entirely, with some researchers now asking seriously what threshold of behavior or internal complexity would even begin to warrant moral consideration for a machine, a question no existing definition of personhood was built to answer. Nothing currently classified as merely a thing has ever been asked whether it agrees with that classification. Neuroscience has mapped which brain regions activate during pain, memory, and decision in extraordinary detail, and still cannot explain why any of that activity is accompanied by an inner experience at all, rather than happening in the dark with no one home. That gap has pushed a small but serious group of philosophers toward a strange conclusion. Perhaps consciousness is not something that emerges from complex matter, but something built into matter itself all the way down. This view, panpsychism, holds that even the most basic constituents of the physical world, something like electrons or fundamental particles, possess some primitive form of experience, and that human consciousness is simply a highly complex combination of countless simpler experiences, rather than a novel property that magically switches on once brains become sufficiently intricate. Proponents argue this actually solves a problem standard physicalism struggles with. If consciousness never exists anywhere in simple matter, it is genuinely mysterious how arranging enough of that matter in a skull could ever produce it from nothing. If some primitive form of experience is already present in the basic ingredients, complexity only needs to combine and organize experience that was already there, rather than manufacture it from scratch. Critics call this the combination problem. Even granting that a single particle has some flicker of primitive experience, it remains deeply unclear how billions of separate primitive experiences could combine into the single, unified experience a human being reports having, rather than remaining billions of disconnected flickers side by side. Mainstream physicalists reject the whole framework, arguing there is no positive evidence that fundamental particles have any inner life whatsoever, and that panpsychism trades one mystery, why consciousness exists, for another equally unexplained mystery about how it combines. A handful of serious physicists and philosophers now take the idea seriously enough to publish on it in respected academic venues, which is itself a measure of how unresolved the deeper question about consciousness has remained. If the particles in this sentence are having any experience of being read, nothing has yet found a way to ask them directly. Ask why you believe your alarm clock is reliable, and you might answer that it has worked correctly every morning this year. Ask why past reliability should predict future reliability, and the honest answer is that it always has before, which is the very assumption in question, argued for using itself as evidence. This is the problem of induction, first sharpened by David Hume in the 18th century. Nearly everything anyone believes about the future, from the sun rising tomorrow to a bridge holding weight, rests on the assumption that patterns observed in the past will continue to hold. Yet no logical argument can prove that assumption without secretly relying on the assumption itself, since any argument that the future will resemble the past because it always has before is simply applying the pattern it is trying to justify. Hume's conclusion was unsettling. This reliance on induction is a deeply ingrained habit of the human mind, useful and probably unavoidable, but not something reason alone can fully certify. A related problem, called the regress problem, threatens justification more broadly. Any belief seems to require justification from some further belief, which itself requires justification from another belief, and so on. Philosophers have proposed 3 ways out, none fully satisfying everyone. Foundationalists argue the chain must eventually stop at some basic beliefs that are self-justifying and need no further support. Coherentists argue justification does not need a foundation at all, only a mutually supporting web of beliefs that hang together consistently. A third option, sometimes accepted reluctantly, allows the chain to circle back on itself or run on indefinitely, neither of which philosophers have found comfortable to embrace. Some philosophers argue the whole search for airtight justification asks for a guarantee no finite mind operating in an uncertain world could ever supply, and that the honest goal was never certainty, but reliability good enough to act on. The alarm clock will still ring tomorrow morning, on exactly the same unproven assumption it rang on today. Gottfried Leibniz, alongside inventing calculus, spent years dreaming of something he called a characteristica universalis, a perfectly precise symbolic language in which every possible thought could be expressed without ambiguity, and every disagreement between two honest reasoners could, in principle, be settled by calculation rather than argument. The dream did not die with Leibniz. Centuries later, philosophers Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell attempted something similar with modern formal logic, trying to build a symbolic system precise enough to express all of mathematics without the vagueness and ambiguity that ordinary language carries by default. Their project, Logicism, aimed to show that mathematics could be derived entirely from logical axioms using an unambiguous formal notation, removing any dependence on intuition or natural language at all. The mathematician Kurt Gödel eventually dealt the broader dream of a complete contradiction-free formal system a serious blow, proving in 1931 that any formal system powerful enough to express basic arithmetic will always contain true statements it cannot prove within its own rules, a result now known as Gödel's incompleteness theorems. The dream of a perfect language has resurfaced repeatedly in different forms, in symbolic logic itself, in efforts to build constructed languages with no ambiguity, and, more recently, in the formal languages used to program computers, which achieve remarkable precision within a narrow domain by sacrificing almost everything that makes ordinary human language rich, flexible, and expressive. That trade-off may be the deepest lesson buried in the whole project. The vagueness, metaphor, and ambiguity that make a perfect logical language impossible are often the very features that let ordinary language carry poetry, humour, and emotional nuance that a purely precise system could never hold. No symbolic system built by any of these thinkers has ever managed to argue two people out of a genuine disagreement about what actually matters. Step into a machine that scans every atom of your body, destroys the original entirely, and reconstructs an exact physical duplicate on Mars a moment later, with every memory, every personality trait, every scar intact. Did you survive the trip, or did you simply die while a stranger who happens to think they are, you walked out the other end? Derek Parfit used this thought experiment to probe what actually matters in survival. If bodily continuity is what makes you you, the teleported person is not really you at all, only a perfect copy, meaning the original person died the instant the scanner finished. If psychological continuity, the unbroken thread of memory and personality, is what matters instead, then the person walking around on Mars really is you, since every relevant psychological fact carried over completely, even though the original body did not. Parfit sharpened the puzzle further with a variant. Suppose the teleporter malfunctions and fails to destroy the original body, so that two people now exist, both with equal claim to being you, one on Earth and one on Mars, each with identical memories up to the moment of transport. Since it seems absurd to say both are somehow the single original person, and equally strange to say one has more claim than the other, Parfit argued this shows personal identity may not be the deep fact people assume it is at all. What actually seems to matter for survival, he suggested, is not some further unbroken metaphysical thread, but simply psychological continuity and connectedness, which can, in principle, branch into more than one continua without there needing to be a single correct answer about which one is really you. Most people report that this conclusion, however logically tidy, does almost nothing to calm the felt terror of stepping into that scanner in the first place. No one has yet built the machine, so no one has had to find out, on the way in, which answer they would actually believe. An octopus can solve puzzles, recognize individual human faces, and, by most measures researchers use to detect suffering, is capable of feeling pain in a way remarkably similar to a vertebrate, despite having a nervous system built on an entirely different evolutionary blueprint than our own. Jeremy Bentham, one of the founders of utilitarian ethics, argued in the 18th century that the morally relevant question about animals was never whether they can reason or talk, but simply whether they can suffer, a capacity that plainly does not depend on language or abstract thought. If suffering is what makes harm morally significant, Bentham's logic implies that a being's species membership should not determine whether its suffering counts any more than a person's race or sex should. Peter Singer revived and extended this argument in the 20th century, coining the term speciesism to describe the assumption that human interests automatically outweigh the comparable interests of other sentient creatures, an assumption he argued has no more solid justification than other historical prejudices based on arbitrary group membership. Critics of this expansive view raise several objections. Some argue that humans have unique moral standing rooted in rational agency and moral responsibility, capacities animals genuinely lack, which justifies treating human interest differently, even while acknowledging that animal suffering still matters morally to some degree. Others point out practical problems. If the capacity to suffer alone grounds strong moral protection, drawing a clear, consistent, and livable line becomes difficult, since insects, mollusks, and even some plants show at least primitive responses to damage, and treating all of them with the moral weight typically reserved for animals like pigs or chimpanzees would upend nearly every human institution built around food, medicine, and industry. Modern welfare science increasingly documents behavioral and physiological signs of suffering in species once assumed to be simple reflex machines with no inner life worth considering at all, narrowing, case by case, the list of creatures anyone can confidently dismiss. The octopus solving a puzzle in a laboratory tank has never been asked what it thinks its solution is worth. A hotel with infinitely many rooms, every single one already occupied, can still accommodate one more guest simply by asking every current guest to move one room over, freeing up room number 1. This is not a trick. It is a direct consequence of how mathematicians define infinity, and it still unsettles most people who encounter it for the first time. The mathematician David Hilbert used this imaginary hotel to illustrate just how strange actual infinity behaves once it is treated as a completed existing quantity rather than an endless process. Ancient and medieval thinkers, including Aristotle, generally accepted only potential infinity, the idea that a process like counting can continue forever without limit, while rejecting actual infinity, a completed infinite quantity treated as a single existing whole, as incoherent or paradoxical. Georg Cantor, working in the late 19th century, upended that caution entirely, developing a rigorous mathematics of actual infinity and proving, startlingly, that some infinities are larger than others. The infinite set of real numbers, Cantor showed, is strictly larger than the infinite set of whole numbers, even though both sets go on forever. Cantor's work provoked fierce resistance from some contemporaries, including accusations that he was trespassing on theological territory previously reserved for questions about the infinite nature of God. Philosophically, the dispute has never fully settled. Some philosophers of mathematics treat Cantor's infinite sets as genuinely existing abstract objects, discovered rather than invented, sitting alongside ordinary numbers in whatever realm mathematical objects occupy. Others argue infinity remains, at bottom, a formal tool extraordinarily useful for building consistent mathematics, without needing to correspond to anything that actually exists as a completed whole anywhere in physical reality, since no telescope or experiment has ever detected an actual infinite quantity of anything. The hotel with infinitely many rooms has never had to turn away a single guest, and it never will, no matter how many more arrive. A student asks a Zen teacher a direct question about the nature of enlightenment, and the teacher says nothing at all, holding up a single flower instead. In certain philosophical and religious traditions, silence in the face of a serious question is not evasion. It is itself an answer, and sometimes the only honest one available. Ludwig Wittgenstein closed his early masterwork, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, with a famous line arguing that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, holding that many of the deepest questions people ask, about ethics, meaning, and the purpose of existence, lie outside what language can meaningfully express at all, not because the questions are unimportant, but because they exceed what propositions built to describe facts can properly say. On his view, attempting to force an answer into language where language does not reach produces only confused nonsense dressed up as profundity, and genuine respect for the depth of a question sometimes requires acknowledging that no sentence will do it justice. Certain mystical and religious traditions arrive at a related conclusion from a different direction, describing the deepest truths as ineffable, beyond the reach of ordinary description, and treating direct verbal answers to certain questions as actively misleading, since any specific claim risks reducing something vast into something falsely small and definite. Critics worry this move can become a convenient shelter, letting a thinker avoid the hard work of clarifying a position by simply declaring the topic beyond words whenever pressed. Not every philosopher accepts that any genuine question is truly beyond language forever. Some argue that calling a question unanswerable in words is often really an admission that no one has yet found the right words, a temporary limitation mistaken for a permanent one, since human language has repeatedly expanded to describe things once thought indescribable, from quantum states to entire new branches of mathematics invented specifically to say what older language could not. The flower held up in that old story has never once been asked to explain itself, and it has never needed to. People asked to rate their own driving skill, honesty, or intelligence consistently rate themselves above the average that the group they belong to could mathematically support, a pattern documented across dozens of self-assessment studies and one of the more robust findings in the psychology of self-perception. Sigmund Freud built an entire theory of mind on the premise that a great deal of mental life happens below conscious awareness, in a region he called the unconscious, shaping behavior, desire, and emotion in ways the conscious mind neither controls nor accurately reports. Whatever the fate of Freud's specific theoretical machinery, much of which has not survived rigorous empirical testing, cognitive science has independently confirmed the broader claim that human self-knowledge is far less reliable than it feels from the inside. People routinely misidentify the actual causes of their own emotional reactions, retroactively construct explanations for choices that were really driven by unnoticed situational factors, and confidently report reasoning processes that experiments suggest were not the real basis for the decision at all. Philosophers call the gap between how confident introspection feels and how accurate it actually is a serious challenge to the classical idea that a person has privileged direct access to their own mind. If introspection can be systematically mistaken about motives, feelings, and even the causes of one's own behavior, then self-knowledge starts to look less like direct perception of an inner fact and more like an interpretation built after the fact, using roughly the same inferential tools a person uses to guess at someone else's mind from the outside. Some philosophers resist this deflationary picture, arguing that even flawed introspection still carries a kind of privileged first-person access that no outside observer could ever match, since only the person having an experience is present for it as it happens, whatever mistakes they later make trying to explain it. The person most confident about their own true motives has never once been able to check that confidence against an outside source with better access than their own. Two people push a lever. One saves 5 lives by diverting a runaway trolley onto a track where it kills one person instead. The other pushes a stranger in front of the same trolley to achieve exactly the same numerical outcome. Most people judge the two acts very differently, even though the arithmetic of lives saved is identical. This is the trolley problem, first introduced by philosopher Philippa Foot and later developed extensively by Judith Jarvis Thomson, and it exposes a real fault line in ethical theory. Consequentialists judge an action's rightness purely by its outcomes, and on a strict version of that view, both trolley cases should be morally equivalent, since both trade 1 life for 5. Deontologists judge an action partly by its intrinsic nature, independent of outcome, and many deontological frameworks distinguish sharply between merely allowing a death as a side effect of achieving a good outcome, and actively using a person as a means to achieve that same outcome, treating the second as a distinct moral violation, even when the numbers match exactly. The persistent, widely shared intuition that pushing the stranger feels far worse than diverting the trolley, even though 5 people live either way, has become one of the most tested moral intuitions in philosophy, replicated across cultures, and more recently, studied using brain imaging that finds the 2 scenarios activate noticeably different patterns of neural response, involving both emotional and more deliberate reasoning circuits. Some researchers read this as evidence that human moral judgment runs on at least 2 distinct systems that do not always agree, one governed by more consequentialist calculation, another by more visceral, rule-based reactions to direct physical harm. Neither camp has managed to fully convert the other, and real ethical dilemmas rarely announce themselves as cleanly as a labelled trolley track. Nobody standing at that lever has ever had the luxury of consulting a philosophy department before deciding which way to pull it. Eugene Vigneur, a physicist who helped build some of the earliest models of nuclear structure, once wrote an essay titled On the Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences, puzzling over a fact most working scientists simply take for granted. Equations invented for abstract, often aesthetic reasons keep turning out, again and again, to describe the physical universe with uncanny precision. Mathematics developed purely to satisfy internal logical elegance has repeatedly anticipated physical discoveries made decades later. Non-Euclidean geometry, developed as an abstract curiosity in the 19th century, turned out to be exactly the mathematics needed to describe the curved spacetime of general relativity. Complex numbers, invented to solve equations with no ordinary real solution, turned out to be essential to quantum mechanics. Vigneur's puzzle was why any of this should work at all, given that mathematicians were not designing these tools with physical prediction in mind, only internal consistency and formal beauty. Some philosophers argue the fit is less mysterious than it first appears, since mathematics is, after all, a human tool refined over centuries specifically by testing it against the physical world, meaning any framework that survived that long selection process would naturally end up well suited to describing physical reality, in the same way that tools shaped by centuries of carpentry naturally end up well suited to working with wood. Others find this explanation insufficient, pointing out that the specific mathematical structures that turn out to be useful are often developed with no physical application in mind whatsoever, sometimes decades before any matching physical phenomenon is even discovered, which looks less like gradual selection and more like genuine, unexplained foresight. A further possibility unsettles the picture further. Perhaps the universe is comprehensible to mathematics, not because reality is fundamentally mathematical, but because human minds, evolved to survive in a physical environment, are only capable of noticing the patterns that happen to be mathematically describable, filtering out anything that might not be, a kind of selection bias built into the observer rather than the observed. The equations keep working, and no one has ever produced a fully satisfying account of why they should. Two friends sit across a table, each certain they understand what the other means, by love, loyalty or grief, and neither has ever had direct access to what those words actually feel like inside the other person's head. Philosophers of language and mind have long worried about a gap between using the same word and sharing the same meaning behind it. Even setting aside the problem of other minds entirely, communication depends on an enormous amount of inference, guessing at intended meaning from context, tone and shared history, filling in gaps the words themselves never fully specify. Paul Grise, working in the mid-20th century, argued that successful conversation relies on unstated cooperative principles, assumptions that a speaker is being relevant, truthful, and appropriately informative, which listeners use to reconstruct meaning that the literal words alone do not carry. This works remarkably well in practice, which is itself evidence that perfect shared meaning was never actually required for functional communication, only a good enough approximation, refined through feedback and correction over the course of an ongoing relationship. Some philosophers argue this good enough approximation is all communication was ever going to achieve, and that the vivid feeling of being truly understood by another person is itself mostly a successful, well-calibrated guess rather than a genuine merging of two separate inner worlds. Others find this deflating account incomplete, arguing that certain relationships, built over years of shared experience, do seem to achieve something closer to genuine attunement, where a friend or partner anticipates a reaction correctly often enough that treating it as mere statistical inference misses something real about the connection. The rise of long-distance relationships, conducted almost entirely through text, has sharpened the stakes of the question, since so much of the nonverbal context that ordinarily helps calibrate meaning, tone of voice, facial expression, timing, is simply unavailable, leaving two people to build an entire shared understanding out of a comparatively narrow channel. Every conversation that has ever felt completely understood was, underneath, still two separate minds making their best guess about each other. For roughly a quarter of every night's sleep, most human brains generate vivid, often bizarre narratives that feel completely real while they are happening, and no scientific consensus yet exists on why any of it occurs at all. Sigmund Freud argued that dreams are disguised expressions of repressed desires, encoded in symbolic form specifically to slip past an internal censor that would otherwise block unacceptable wishes from conscious awareness, a theory that shaped a century of popular imagination about dream interpretation, whatever its scientific standing today. Later researchers proposed very different explanations rooted in neurobiology rather than hidden meaning. The activation synthesis hypothesis, developed by Alan H. Obson and Robert M. Carley in the 1970s, argued that dreams are the brain's attempt to make narrative sense of essentially random neural activity generated during a particular stage of sleep, meaning dream content might reflect the brain's storytelling machinery working on noise, rather than any disguised message needing to be decoded. More recent theories occupy a middle ground, proposing that dreaming serves genuine cognitive functions, such as consolidating memories, processing emotional experiences from the preceding day, or rehearsing responses to potential threats in a low-stakes simulated environment, a view sometimes called the threat simulation theory. Supporting evidence includes findings that people recovering from significant emotional trauma often show altered dream content related to that trauma, and that memory performance can be affected by dream-rich sleep stages, though researchers disagree sharply about how directly any of this evidence supports a specific theory of what dreams are actually for. Philosophically, dreams raise a stranger question underneath the scientific one. While a dream is happening, it typically feels every bit as real and continuous as waking experience, which some philosophers, going back to Descartes, have used to question how confident anyone can really be, in any given moment, that they are not dreaming right now. Whatever a dream is actually doing, it convinces its audience completely every single night, and is usually forgotten within minutes of the show ending. Global rates of extreme poverty have fallen sharply over the past 2 centuries. Vaccines have eliminated diseases that once killed millions, and by many measurable standards, human life today is longer, healthier, and less violent than at almost any earlier point in recorded history. Whether any of that adds up to genuine progress in a deeper philosophical sense is a separate and much harder question. Enlightenment thinkers largely assumed history moves in a broadly upward direction, toward greater knowledge, greater freedom, and greater human flourishing, a view sometimes called progressivism. Critics have challenged this from multiple angles. Some point out that technological and material improvement has repeatedly been accompanied by new forms of harm. Industrialization brought unprecedented productivity alongside unprecedented pollution, and in the 20th century, weapons capable of destroying civilization outright, suggesting that measuring progress purely by material or technological advance risks missing costs that only become visible later. Others argue that progress in one domain, medicine, say, or communication, does not automatically translate into moral or spiritual progress, pointing to the fact that some of history's worst atrocities were carried out, using the era's most advanced available technology and organizational sophistication. Philosopher of history thinkers going back to Nietzsche and later expanded by postmodern critics have questioned whether progress is even a coherent concept applied to history as a whole, rather than a story imposed afterward, by whichever perspective happens to be telling it, since what counts as an improvement depends heavily on which values are used to measure it, and those values themselves shift across eras in ways that make cross-era comparison genuinely difficult. Defenders of a more modest version of progress argue that some specific, measurable improvements, reduced child mortality, expanded literacy, declining rates of violent death, are real regardless of how the larger philosophical question about a grand historical direction gets settled, since a parent whose child survives a once fatal illness has experienced something concretely and unambiguously better, whatever else remains contested about history's overall arc. The graph of global child mortality keeps falling, and no philosopher has yet settled what, beyond the falling number itself, that fall actually proves. Imagine a machine that could plug directly into your brain and generate a perfectly convincing simulated life, filled with exactly the experiences you would most want, indistinguishable from the inside from genuine achievement, love, and pleasure. Robert Nozick asked, in 1974, whether you would plug in, and predicted that most people, on reflection, would say no, even knowing the simulated pleasure would feel completely real. Zick's experience machine thought experiment was aimed at hedonism, The view that pleasure and the absence of pain are the only things that ultimately matter for a good life, and by extension, that a life should be judged good or bad purely by the balance of positive to negative experience it contains. If pure, guaranteed pleasure were really all that mattered, plugging into the machine should be an easy choice. The widely shared hesitation to do so suggests that most people value things the machine cannot provide. Actually accomplishing something, actually being connected to real other people, actually being the author of a genuinely lived life, rather than merely experiencing a convincing simulation of having those things. This has pushed many philosophers toward richer theories of well-being that go beyond simple pleasure. Objective list theories propose that a good life includes a specific set of goods, such as genuine knowledge, real achievement, authentic relationships, and meaningful autonomy, that matter for well-being independent of whether they produce a pleasurable feeling in the moment. Desire satisfaction theories propose instead that a good life is one in which a person's genuine, considered desires are actually satisfied in reality, not merely experienced as satisfied, which also explains the reluctance to plug into no H6 machine, since a simulated satisfaction of a desire is not the same as its actual fulfillment. Modern debates about virtual reality, immersive entertainment, and even certain mood-altering medications have given no H6 decades-old thought experiment renewed urgency, since the boundary between a fulfilling life and a merely pleasant simulation of one is no longer purely hypothetical. Nobody has ever built the actual machine, and the strength of most people's instinctive refusal has told philosophers more about what a good life requires than any amount of pleasure ever could. Aristotle distinguished between two very different kinds of justice more than 2,000 years ago, and the distinction still structures most modern debates about fairness without most people ever having heard his terms for it. Distributive justice concerns how goods, opportunities, and burdens should be divided among members of a society, who gets what share of wealth, education, or opportunity, and by what principle that division should be decided, whether equal shares, need-based shares, merit-based shares, or something else entirely. Corrective justice, by contrast, concerns how wrongs should be righted after the fact, restoring balance between a wrongdoer and a wronged party through compensation, restitution, or punishment. Aristotle argued both required a specific kind of proportional equality rather than strict identical treatment, since treating unequal cases identically can itself produce a new unfairness. Modern theories have multiplied well beyond Aristotle's framework. Egalitarian theories argue perfect justice requires equal outcomes, or at minimum equal opportunity, across a population, though they disagree sharply about which specific dimension, income, wealth, welfare, or capability, equality should actually be measured in. Libertarian theories argue justice is primarily about respecting voluntary transactions and legitimate property rights, with unequal outcomes being perfectly just as long as the process that produced them was fair, regardless of how unequal the resulting distribution looks. Utilitarian theories judge distributions by whichever arrangement produces the greatest total welfare, which can, in principle, justify significant inequality if it happens to maximize the overall sum, a conclusion many find deeply counterintuitive when applied to real cases involving genuine deprivation. No society in recorded history has ever fully implemented any single one of these theories in pure form, and most real institutions borrow uneasily from several incompatible theories at once, patched together more by political compromise than by settled philosophical agreement. A perfectly just society remains, so far, a thought experiment every real government has approximated only partially and only ever in one direction at a time. A single electron fired at a barrier with two slits behaves like a wave, passing through both slits at once and interfering with itself right up until an instrument is placed to detect which slit it actually goes through, at which point it behaves like a simple particle passing through only one. Nothing about the setup changes except the presence of a measurement. This is the core mystery of quantum mechanics measurement problem, and it has never been fully resolved despite a century of extraordinary experimental confirmation of the underlying mathematics. The standard, historically dominant interpretation, associated with Niels Bohr and often called the Copenhagen interpretation, holds that a quantum system exists in a superposition of multiple possible states until measurement forces it into one definite outcome, treating the act of observation itself as playing some special role in producing a determinate reality. Critics, including Albert Einstein, found this deeply unsatisfying, since it seems to grant an oddly privileged role to measurement and to the observers performing it, in a universe that otherwise appears to run on impersonal physical law with no special status for conscious minds. Competing interpretations try to avoid granting observation any special metaphysical role. The many worlds interpretation proposes that every possible outcome of a quantum measurement actually occurs, each in its own separate, non-interacting branch of reality, meaning nothing is ever really collapsed by observation. The observer themselves simply ends up in one particular branch among countless others. Pilot wave theories propose that particles always have definite positions guided by an underlying wave, with no genuine collapse or special role for measurement needed at all, only the appearance of one, arising from the limits of what can be measured in practice. Physicists broadly agree on how to calculate what a given experiment will show. They remain sharply divided on what any of that calculation is actually telling us about what is happening when no one is looking. The electron has never once explained, to anyone's satisfaction, what it was doing in the moment before it was caught. If a random arrangement of ink somehow formed the exact text of a great poem, purely by chance, with no mind ever having intended a single word of it, would the poem still mean what it appears to mean? This question sits behind a real disagreement about where meaning actually comes from. Intentionalist critics argue that the meaning of a text is fundamentally tied to what its author intended to communicate, and that interpreting a work correctly means, as much as possible, recovering that original intention, since without an author's purpose behind it, marks on a page are just marks, arranged without any communicative content of their own. Formalist and later reader response critics push back hard against this, arguing that meaning is produced, at least in part, by the act of interpretation itself, shaped by a reader's own context, associations, and questions, meaning a single text can generate multiple genuinely valid readings that its original author never intended and might not even recognize. Roland Barthes pushed the argument furthest in a 1967 essay declaring, provocatively, the death of the author, arguing that treating an author's biography and stated intentions as the final authority over a text's meaning actually limits and impoverishes interpretation, and that once a text is released into the world, it belongs to its readers as much as to whoever wrote it. Critics of this view worry it can license almost any interpretation, however disconnect from what a text plausibly says, since without any anchor in authorial intention, there is little left to distinguish a genuinely insightful reading from simple projection. The question extends well beyond literature. Natural patterns, from the shapes of clouds to the branching of rivers, can look astonishingly meaningful and intentional to a human observer, despite arising from purely physical processes with no author, no intention, and no message behind them at all, which raises a version of the same puzzle in a completely different domain. How much of the meaning people find in the world was ever actually placed there, and how much of it is supplied entirely by the mind doing the finding? No cloud has ever confirmed or denied the shape a passerby was certain they saw in it. A promise made to a dying parent, never witnessed by anyone else, still feels binding to most people, long after that parent is gone and in no position to notice whether it was kept. Philosophers have never fully agreed on why an obligation to someone who no longer exists should still carry any weight at all. Most ethical theories are built around obligations between people who exist simultaneously, capable at least in principle of some kind of mutual relationship. The dead cannot be helped, harmed, consulted or reciprocated with in any ordinary sense, which makes it philosophically awkward to explain why promises to them, respect for their wishes, or the maintenance of their reputation should still matter once they are gone. Some philosophers argue that obligations to the dead are really, at bottom, obligations to the living. Keeping a promise to a deceased parent matters because breaking it would damage the promise keeper's own integrity and the trust of other living people watching, not because the dead person is actually being wronged by the breach in any direct sense. Others resist this deflationary account, arguing it misses something real about how people actually experience these obligations, which rarely feel like obligations to bystanders at all, but like obligations owed directly to the specific person who is gone. Some philosophers propose that a person's interests can, in a limited sense, survive their death through what happens to their legacy, their unfulfilled wishes, and their reputation, meaning a person can still be wronged posthumously if their explicit wishes are betrayed or their reputation is deliberately destroyed. even though they are no longer present to experience the harm. The question has practical stakes well beyond philosophy seminars, shaping real debates over whether the dead can be defamed, whether their remains can be used against their stated wishes, and whether a will expressing desires about property or care should bind people who never agreed to those specific terms, although it was still alive to negotiate them. Every grave visited out of obligation rather than habit is evidence of a debt most people feel and very few can fully explain. An ancient legend tells of a ship belonging to the hero Theseus, kept seaworthy for centuries by replacing its rotting planks one at a time, until eventually not a single original plank remained. Is it still the same ship? And if someone had collected every discarded original plank and reassembled them elsewhere, which vessel, if either, would be the real one? The puzzle, first posed in something close to this form by the ancient writer Plutarch, is not really about ships at all. It is a stress test for the concept of identity over time, applied to something concrete enough to make the abstraction unavoidable. If identity depends on physical material, the ship with all new planks is not the original, and the ship rebuilt from the discarded originals is. If identity depends instead on continuity of form and function, the gradually repaired ship, which never stopped sailing and never lost its shape or purpose, remains the true original, and the reassembled pile of old planks is merely a replica built later from spare parts. Modern philosophers use the puzzle to probe identity questions well beyond wooden ships. A human body replaces the overwhelming majority of its cells over the course of years. A river is never composed of the same water twice, and an organization can survive complete turnover of every single member while somehow remaining in every meaningful sense the same institution. In each case, the puzzle forces a choice. Does identity track material continuity, functional continuity, or some combination that resists a single clean rule, applied consistently the same way across ships, rivers, bodies, and institutions? Some philosophers argue the puzzle has no single correct answer, because identity was never a single unified concept to begin with, but a cluster of related, sometimes competing criteria that happen to agree in ordinary cases and diverge only in artificially constructed extreme ones, like this ship, built specifically to make them diverge. The ship has been sailing through this particular argument for roughly 2,000 years, and not one plank of the original dispute has ever been replaced by a settled answer. A single photograph of a famine can move a viewer to donate money faster than pages of carefully reasoned statistical argument about the same crisis. Even though the photograph conveys, strictly speaking, far less specific information than the report, aesthetic philosophers have long argued that art accesses a kind of understanding that discursive, fact-based argument struggles to reach on its own. Aristotle argued in his Poetics that tragic drama produces a distinctive emotional and cognitive experience he called catharsis, a purging or clarification of emotion through witnessing represented suffering that teaches audiences something about human nature, and consequence that abstract moral instruction alone rarely achieves as effectively. Later philosophers extended similar claims to music, painting, and literature more broadly, arguing that a great novel can convey the felt texture of grief, hope, or moral compromise with a precision and immediacy that a philosophical essay on the same emotions, however rigorous, usually cannot match. Skeptics push back, arguing that whatever art conveys is not really propositional truth in the strict sense philosophy usually means by the term verifiable claims that can be true or false, but something closer to a vivid, persuasive impression that can move people regardless of whether the underlying claim is accurate, which is precisely why propaganda and advertising borrow so heavily from artistic technique. On this skeptical view, art's power to move an audience should be treated with some caution rather than mistaken for a genuine form of knowledge, since a beautifully rendered falsehood can feel just as true in the moment as a beautifully rendered fact. Defenders respond that this skepticism proves too much, since scientific explanation also relies heavily on persuasive, simplified models, metaphors, and narrative structure to convey findings effectively, and being emotionally persuasive does not automatically make a claim false any more than being dry and statistical automatically makes a claim true. The photograph and the statistical report were describing the exact same famine, and only one of them, most people report afterward, actually made them feel its weight. A doctor promises complete confidentiality to a patient, and later learns, during a session, that the same patient is planning serious harm to a specific named person. Honouring the promise of confidentiality and preventing the harm cannot both be fully satisfied at once, and philosophers call situations like this genuine moral dilemmas, distinct from merely difficult decisions. A true moral dilemma, in the philosophical sense, is not simply a hard choice between a clearly right option and a clearly wrong one. It is a situation in which an agent faces two or more genuine moral obligations that cannot all be honoured simultaneously, no matter how carefully or wisely the agent acts, meaning some moral failure is guaranteed regardless of what is chosen. Some philosophers argue that a fully coherent, correctly structured moral theory should never generate genuine dilemmas like this, since a truly consistent set of moral rules ought to rank obligations in a way that always yields a single correct answer, even if that answer is painful to carry out. If a theory produces situations with no non-violating option available at all, on this view, the theory itself may be flawed or incomplete rather than reality itself being genuinely tragic. Other philosophers, including Bernard Williams, argue that treating every apparent dilemma as solvable in principle misses something real and important about moral life. Some situations genuinely do involve incommensurable values that cannot be reduced to a single common scale for comparison, meaning there may be no fact of the matter about which obligation should have won out, only a residue of legitimate moral regret left over no matter which path is chosen, a phenomenon Williams called moral remainder. Legal systems build entire specialized doctrines specifically to handle situations resembling this structure, from the duty to warn a potential victim overriding professional confidentiality in specific circumstances to complex defenses built around necessity and competing obligations, each an attempt to formalize a resolution that philosophy itself has never fully agreed was possible to reach cleanly. The doctor in that consulting room will make a choice either way, and something genuinely owed will go unpaid no matter which one it is. Socrates, by his own account, never claimed to possess wisdom. He claimed only to know that he did not know, and spent his life pestering the confident citizens of Athens with careful questions until their certainties came apart in his hands, an activity that eventually got him sentenced to death by the very city he had spent decades interrogating. The Socratic method was never really designed to produce final answers. It was designed to expose the gap between how confidently people hold a belief and how well that belief can actually survive careful questioning, on the theory that most unexamined confidence is built on foundations that dissolve the moment someone asks a patient, specific, well-aimed question about them. Socrates called the result of this process aporia, a state of productive puzzlement, in which a person's previous certainty has been dismantled, but no new certainty has yet arrived to replace it, a state many people experience as deeply uncomfortable, and some philosophers argue, is actually the most honest state most serious questions ever put anyone in. Across every question this list has raised, from why anything exists at all to whether the self is real to what any of us actually owe a stranger, the same pattern recurs. Careful argument sharpens each question considerably. It rarely resolves any of them completely. And the philosophers who have spent the most rigorous, sustained attention on these puzzles have, overwhelmingly, ended up more precise about the difficulty rather than triumphantly finished with it. Some thinkers find this outcome disappointing, evidence that philosophy has failed at the one job that should matter most. Others argue the opposite, that a discipline whose entire value lay in delivering comfortable final answers would have stopped being interesting and stopped being honest centuries ago. Socrates asked his questions in the Agora of Athens roughly 2,400 years ago, certain of almost nothing except that the asking itself mattered. The questions in this list are still exactly where he left them, waiting unbothered by how long anyone takes. Somewhere tonight, another child is asking another parent why, and that parent is one honest answer away from admitting they do not fully know either, the same gap this list has been sitting inside for 2 hours. It did not close. It was never going to close, not because the thinking involved was careless, but because these are the specific questions that seem built to survive careful thinking rather than yield to it. That is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. A question that has occupied serious minds for 2,000 years and still has no settled answer is not evidence that thinking failed. Socrates never settled anything either, and he is still one of the most useful thinkers anyone has ever produced, precisely because he made not knowing into something worth doing carefully, rather than something to be ashamed of and quickly covered over. None of these 45 questions asked anything of you except attention, and none of them are finished being asked. The philosopher who first wondered whether tomorrow's version of a person is really the same person, as today's did not resolve it before dying, and neither did anyone since. The physicist puzzling over why an electron behaves differently once someone is watching it has not resolved that either, only sharpened exactly how strange the behaviour actually is. That sharpening, rather than resolution, may be the most honest thing careful thought has ever managed to offer anyone on these particular subjects. The questions will still be here tomorrow, unresolved, patient, and exactly as interesting as they were before anyone opened this list. Whatever answers eventually arrive for any of them, if any ever do, they will not arrive tonight, and they were never really the point of sitting with the questions in the first place. Thank you for spending this time with them.